Hello, everyone. My name is Jay Cormier. I'm here with legendary Matt Wagner. Matt, how you doing?
Pretty good. Hey, everybody.
I'm good. All right. So we're here doing a Q&A, and we're definitely inviting everybody that's watching to type their questions in. Any kind of question you have for Matt, we're here to answer it. So let's get started. Matt, we're going to talk about the board game. We're going to talk about all that kind of stuff. But I kind of want to go all the way back to little Matt. And I want to. What were your inspirations when you were growing up, as far as from reading? Was it comics? Was it books? What kind of things got you excited when you were young?
It was both. My mom had been an English teacher before I was born, and so she was constantly on me to read.
Good mom.
I grew up in a small town. Our local library had a summer reading program for kids, where if you read 10 books, you got a certificate with 10 gold stars on it.
Love it.
I would usually get 2 or 3 over the course of the summer. And I was an only child, grew up kind of far out, and I didn't have a lot of video entertainment back in those days, so I drew to entertain myself. And comics were both drawing and reading all in one, like, gorgeous little package,
Yeah.
And unlike a lot of English teachers of her day, my mom didn't mind that I was reading comics. As long as he's reading, she thought I'd grow out of them eventually, And of course I did grow on to read a whole lot of other stuff, but she also helped expand my horizons in that when I was young, so this is the mid-'60s, at the point of purchase at the checkout at the grocery store, instead of People magazine and the National Enquirer and all that shit, there would be a rack of Classics Illustrated comics.
Yeah.
And so she would buy those for me. So that was my first exposure to Shakespeare, to Dickens, to Robert Louis Stevenson, et cetera, Mark Twain. And in fact, a number of years ago, it was about 2 years ago, I read Ivanhoe, the original Ivanhoe, and I still had my copy of the Classics Illustrated. So after I would finish a scene, I would go back and look at that specific page in the comic. That was a terrific bit of cross pollination there.
That's fun.
And then I grew up. I kept reading comics and I kept reading books, and I finally went to art school in Philadelphia, and I met. By happenstance on the elevator one day, the guys that formed my original publishing company. And Kimiko. It was always pronounced Kimiko.
I didn't know that. That's
a point of contention where people argue one side and the other, but it was Kimiko for sure. And they were my first publishers, and the first thing I ever did was a little 8-page story in Primer number 2, which introduced Grendel. And we were black and white comics that preceded the black and white boom of the 80s, right?
Right.
So nobody wanted black and white comics at that point. 3 years later, everybody wanted black and white comics, So we decided to move to color production, and that's when I developed Mage, my other series that I'm known for.
Yes.
But once I started rolling on Mage, I heard from various readers saying, hey, what happened to Grendel? You never finished that story. So I adapted it to be a backup story in Mage. And then after Mage was all done, we collected that into one volume, which was the first Hunter Rose story. And then from there, we continued it into a monthly, and I came up with the idea of having the Grendel persona basically change with every storyline. So we
and I got questions about this.
So it goes on through time. You have different characters with different motivations and different, generally pretty dark outcomes. Grendel's not a happy tale.
So
then it's been going on for over 40 years now.
No kidding. Yeah, it's been amazing. It's just the story of Grendel is just absolutely epic and bonkers in where it ends up, and we'll get there as I ask you some more questions. And so, do you think that comics was always in your future? Was that was there ever a plan B or was this a plan B and there was a plan A, or?
Well, originally, I knew I wanted to go into art. I knew I wanted to go into make drawing my living. But again, when I started out, there was no option. There weren't any independent publishers, really. You had to live either in New York or Connecticut or New Jersey because there was no overnight delivery. You took the train into the actual offices, the publishing offices. You picked up your gig in person by hand. Right. You went home, you did your work, you dropped it off again. So So that didn't really that wasn't really an option. But then, as I said, I moved to Philadelphia to go to art school, and it was the very beginning of the independent boom. And I met these guys who had these big dreams of forming an independent publishing company, which, in addition to not having to live in New York, for the first time ever, artists got to own their intellectual property. Because previous to that, the publisher owned everything, no questions
Yeah,
asked.
yeah.
That was in the work for hire agreement you signed. One of the great tragedy tales of our industry is the fact that the two young guys that created Superman sold it for $120.
Yeah.
That was back in 1938, so they were thrilled, but
Yeah.
but went on to be a multi-billion-dollar worldwide property that they really didn't benefit off of much for the rest of their lives.
So that was at the core of the Kimiko.
Creator ownership and creator authority. Yep.
So that really, I didn't even know that predated the whole image boom when that was.
Oh yeah, by years.
Decade maybe. Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, there were a few examples before us. There was Dave Sim with Cerebus, and there was Richard and Wendy Peeney with ElfQuest.
But weren't they just? Well, I guess not ElfQuest, but Cerebus was like just self-published entirely.
Yeah. But there again, he owned all his rights. He was totally in control of his property.
Yeah. My claim to fame is not a claim to fame at all. Both the Cerebus, he's from my hometown of Kitchener, Ontario, and
is that where you're originally from? Yes.
The back page of every comic of Cerebus was an ad for my comic book store where I grew up.
Was it? Oh, great.
Comic books, yeah. So like you literally just like absolutely happenstance you met these Kimiko guys like you just say in an elevator?
Yeah. One of them had on at that point there was kind of only one major line of conventions in the country. It was called creation conventions, and they're still around. They still exist here and there. But I got on the elevator, and this one guy had a creation conventions T-shirt on, and I went, comics, because of course, comics fans weren't all over the place like they are now. We were a rare breed,
Yeah.
It was almost like you met in a dark alley under a smoky lamp, and we just struck up a friendship and just kept going,
Like a literal elevator pitch.
Yeah.
Yep. And so just from that conversation, you're like, well, can I write something for you?
They had not, they were still in school. They were publishing an in-school, I don't even want to call it a newspaper. It was almost a pamphlet. Yeah, a zine. It was called Duckwork.
Okay.
And so it had a little bit of school news, but then it had duck cartoons, and my gig was I did duck-themed movie poster takeoffs. So like,
I'd like to see those.
Raiders of the Lost Duck and
Come on,
Roller Duck and and Duck Throat starring Linda Lovedrake.
I love it. That those are those hidden forever, or we ever?
I have like one of them. Somebody's got them. I don't know. You can probably search around online. Somebody's probably got some.
Okay, so now you've got your first crack at writing a comic. What made you choose Grendel? And I guess even part of this question is the history of the name of Grendel, which obviously comes from the Beowulf kind of a story and poem. But how did that come to be? Like, I'm going to take that.
So I was interested in doing a story about an anti-hero, about the villain. We really didn't have that in comics in those days. Now, of course, it's ubiquitous. Yeah. But Marvel had tried to do a couple of. They did a thing called Super Villain Team Up. Never lasted more than a couple of issues. DC had tried to do a Joker comic that only lasted 2 issues. Can you imagine that? Joker wasn't popular enough at that point.
Right.
But then when I was about 12 or 13, I read a book called Grendel that was written by a novelist named John Gardner, and it's a story of Beowulf, but told from the monster's point of view. So that really like kind of threw me on my ass that you can look at things from the villain's point of view. And then when I was in high school, I discovered the work of Michael Moorcock and specifically the Elric saga. And Elric's this fascinating character who you really kind of like, but he does just horrible shit throughout the entire run of the. He eventually ends up killing anybody he ever loved. And so that really struck a nerve with me, and I decided that if I wanted to make my mark in comics, I would do the opposite of what the mainstream guys were doing.
Smart.
So I decided that my villain would be suave and handsome and articulate, and my hero would be brutal and savage and uncivilized. You know.
And that's the Argent, the wolf creature.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, that's it. So that pretty much answers my question, was the fact that it's a very realistic. Everything about the comic is so ultra realistic, and then we have this fantastical wolf creature.
Yeah.
So, and it's just
It's so funny because I just kind of naturally fall into genre mashing.
right.
It's not even kind of purposeful. I just kind of end up doing it. You know, it's just like,
Do what you like.
I got this crime story, and here's a werewolf. You know?
Oh, that's amazing. And so then, then it kind of broke out, and you got to tell your whole story, and you kind of retold the story of Grendel and Eddie and Hunter Rose, and with the Devil by the Deed.
Devil by the Deed, yeah. And then, as that was wrapping up, Kamiko came to me and said, "We'd like to make Grendel into an ongoing
There
monthly."
you go.
And I thought, well, that's going to be hard. I just killed the character. You know?
Yeah. Oh, so before we get into that,
I drew inspiration from the old comic strip, The Phantom, because in The Phantom, he's the 22nd or 23rd in an ongoing line of phantoms.
Oh, I didn't know that.
It started generations ago. His great grandfather was a victim of pirates, and so became this hero to fight piracy. And his son became the next one, and his son became the next one. So I thought, well, what about if I do that with Grendel? If I have it just kind of move on to the next person and the next person and the next person. And then what really intrigued me about that is the thought of doing, I was a very young creator and I really wanted to stretch my wings and try a lot of different stuff. And the thought of doing an ongoing monthly seemed repetitive. And I thought, if I can do it as basically an ongoing series of miniseries, so I'll change it every time. We have the next Grendel die and somebody else becomes Grendel. And along with that, we will change the art and the art style every single time, you know. And so it was really a fertile ground so far as creative experimenting and really, as I said, stretching my wings in many different styles of storytelling and for the first time working with other artists, because after I finished Grendel Devil by the Deed, I decided I should try and write for other artists, because I didn't want to lock myself into feeling I had already had everything figured out. You know, I wanted to be able to see through other people's eyes. So by writing a script for somebody, it would come back and I would be like, oh, so that's how they visualized that. That's not quite the way I was thinking of it, but now I see a different way of looking at it, you know? And so, to accentuate that, I didn't write what's called a full script. So in the business, when you have a full script, it'll say page 1. And then it describes each panel, and it already has all the balloons and the captions and everything already there. And sometimes the writer will even be pretty heavy-handed and try and describe the design of the page, how the panels ought to lay out and everything. I didn't want to do that. I thought, you know, look, I can draw. If I want that level of control, I should draw it, you know. I wanted to collaborate. So I wrote in what's at the time was called Marvel style, which is you just write a plot. So I didn't pace out the panels or anything. I would just say page 1, here's what happens. I describe the action. Then the artists would draw it. It came back to me. And then seeing this action made real, then I would script over top of that, because the visual images would suggest, you know, syntax, phrasings, all sorts of details that
true collaboration.
The first time, you know, Yep.
Wow, that's amazing. We do have some questions in the side, but I'm going to save them because they're about the board game. So I'm going to wait till we get to the board game section of it. So keep asking the questions if you have questions out there. That's amazing. Going back to Devil by the Deed, what also strikes me with nice product placement, Matt.
Yeah, this isn't mass produced. This is a one-off. It was a gift from somebody.
That was great. That was so very subtle. What also strikes me with that comic is I'll call it revolutionary art style. And you kind of introduce this, it's kind of now famous, your style, this Art Nouveau style. What inspired you? Because we hadn't seen comics like that at that point that looked like that took advantage of the page and the way you did. And it wasn't just panel. Like you were breaking it up left, right, and center.
Yeah, well, part of that was due to the format. And so the original 3 black and white Grendels weren't like that at all. They were more traditional comics, you know.
Yep.
But once I readapted it to be a backup feature in the back of the pages of Mage, I had 4 pages with every installment. So
Okay.
somehow in 4 pages, I had to get across the same amount of thrills and story and narrative.
Right.
So I came up with this idea of doing it as an illustrated story, So basically, this panorama of images peppered with captions. There was no
Right.
dialogue per se, no dialogue balloons, and I went with the conceit that what we're reading is a history book about Grendel. It's written by a journalist after Grendel has died. And from there, I took inspiration from Thomas Mallory's Le Morte d'Arthur, the most famous book about King Arthur, because, of course, that translates to the death of King Arthur. So it's a history looking back at King Arthur.
That's
So all those things played into this, what you're talking about there, that kind of unique illustrated novel sort of style, as opposed to, but it's not really an illustrated novel because that would be a page of text and an illustration. So
totally.
this is text designed into, again, as I said, this panorama of illustrations. In his original introduction that Alan Moore wrote for it, he described it almost as pinball game designs. And I
Interesting.
really like that because
Yeah.
it gives it a kinetic sort of description.
That is fantastic. Um, that the two things that struck me the most about reading the Hunter Rose story was the art style, but then also once we get to the omnibus where you collect all the stories that tell the complete story of the first Grendel, is the idea that the story is told from so many different perspectives. And
Yeah, yeah.
characters that you've never heard of before all of a sudden are the protagonists in this one little story.
So
Where did that come from?
that came from the fact that the original storyline, Devil by the Deed, again, it's about the death. It's about Grendel's downfall, right? So you always get the feeling reading that original one that he had all these other adventures that we're just not hearing about. They're
Yeah,
referred to kind of obliquely,
right.
but then, as time went on and I was looking to do some different stuff, looking to collaborate with other artists, and of course by that point I had become pals with a lot of artists across the field, and I just thought, like I'm gonna like summon in all my friends and let's do an 8-page Grendel story, and I'll come up with a different way of doing it for each and every one. Again, trying to continue that spirit of experimentation and such. Uh, here's uh, here's one particular one. There's fellow named Andy Watson who
Hmm.
has kind of an anime, Americanized anime sort of style, right? He
Okay.
did a book called Geisha for my friends at Oni Press, and I liked it a lot. And they asked me to write the introduction for it, so I did the introduction for the book. And as a thank you, Andy sent me this piece of Grendel art that he had done, and it was Grendel again looking very Japanese on a horse riding off into the sunset through the breakers of the waves. And I thought, God damn! Now I got to do something. I got to get that into a story somewhere, right?
That's
So
awesome.
I invited him on for this project, the Black, White, and Red.
Oh,
We did 2 series: Black, White, and Red, and Red, White, and Black. That were all 8-page short stories about untold tales of Hunter Rose. And so for his, I just described full page illustrations, and then I wrote a Grendel haiku under each one. And instead of being, about beauty and contemplating eternity, they're fucked up haikus about death and death and not escaping fate and stuff like that.
I don't think I realized they were haikus. That's
Yeah, they're
awesome.
haikus. Yep,
That's
yep.
great. Oh man, um, you kind of touched on this a little bit, but so Devil by the Deed is done, and now it's. Are you at a monthly series now with that, or no? You weren't at a monthly series at that point. That's when Kimiko said, "Hey, now we want a monthly series."
Correct. Yes. Yeah.
And
Yep.
so that's when you said, "Okay, well, what's next?" And you kind of
Yep.
gave us a little bit about that, about like, okay, I gotta
Yep.
pass it on.
Yep.
What do you
Yep.
what do you think is that? Because the concept of Grendel initially became a passing of the mask to an effect, right? Like then the next person wearing the next person, but then it grows. What do you think is at the core of what has to be in a Grendel story or a Grendel character?
The theme is aggression and how violence, because we try to really never moralize the violence in Grendel. It always comes back on the user somehow. and violence marks you in ways that you never escape. And sometimes that's actually, like, for instance, the ultra futuristic version, Grendel Prime. He's a real conundrum, because on one level he's moral and upright and full of
Yeah.
honor, like a knight
Most
or a
heroic.
samurai,
Yeah.
and so is he. So, as I said, there's this more moralize about. But yeah, it has to be. It has to be. I always kind of describe it, the Grendel's about potential that never reaches its zenith. You know what I mean? That never. For instance, Hunter Rose. Hunter Rose could have been. He was a genius, and he could have been something, but he let the loss of his one great love drive him into a megalomaniacal direction that took him down a very, very dark path.
Yep.
Um, Christine Spar, the one that follows him, on one level, we can empathize with her because she's doing what she's doing to avenge the death of her son, and yet slowly you see her slip into absolute madness,
Right.
and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, on down the line.
Oh, fascinating. I have some more, but I do have some questions from the side that I'm going to ask out here.
Sure.
Some great fans are watching, which is great. Somebody's been a reader 50 years, has 30,000 comics. Devil by Deed is in the top 10. I'm sure you hear these kind of things a lot. I don't think it's too late to say that Grendel's a seminal comic book in the history of our comics. Is amazing. HP Fabe is saying, is there any chance of seeing a reprint of the comics, the Kimiko Silverback miniseries?
Yeah, possibly someday. We don't have any of the film or any of the original art. So at this point, it would take scanning actual printed pages, and then bleeding them of the color, and then recoloring it. So you're already looking at production costs there that are pretty expensive. So I don't know. Maybe when that becomes easier and cheaper, then yeah.
Or you can redo it like your new Hunter Rose comic.
Yeah, possibly. Could just completely start over and redraw it. Yeah. What for people that don't know what Jay is referring to there is we had the original Grendel Devil by the Deed, which was compiled from those backup features in Mage, and then several years ago, the 40th anniversary of the character was coming up, and I was looking for some big special project to roll out. And when I went back and looked at the original, even I was kind of surprised to find it's only 37 pages long. And for a story, that's the original storyline. That's not counting the Black, White, and Reds and the Red, White, and Black short stories. Those accumulated more stories over the years. But for a storyline that was so seminal and then launched this long, many thousand page and centuries of storytime legacy, that seemed a little inadequate. So I said to Dark Horse, let me just, as if I were a band re-recording one of my seminal albums, let me just start over. And I'm going to do it, it's still going to have the same flavor. It's going to be told the same way, but I'm going to expand it to 120 pages as opposed to 37. So that's what Devil by Deed Masters Edition was. It came out just a few years ago.
That's still available.
Yeah, very much so, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. We have another question.
The original is still available in the omnibuses. So that version exists in the omnibuses.
Great.
But the, otherwise the Masters Edition kind of supplants it as the definitive version of Hunter Rose's story.
Is that kind of like your George Lucasing the?
Yeah, I guess you could say that. Yeah. Hopefully, to a little more acclaim than his efforts.
Yeah, that wasn't meant as a slight in
But it wasn't so much. I wasn't so much fiddling. I was completely redoing. So
yeah.
Part of it was it's part of what I like about it is you get to see me as this very mature and experienced artist doing this same story, as opposed to the fledgling wannabe that I was way back in the day.
It's an interesting to compare them. Actually,
different take. Again, if you're using a musical riff, consider let's say Paul McCartney towards the end of his career, as opposed to very early in the Beatles.
Yeah.
He's a different sort of creator. He's has different sort of skill set. We
have another question from Martin. What color palette do you prefer to use when illustrating Grendel? Is it driven by the Grendel version you're writing for?
Sure. Although over the years, I think maybe what he's referring to there is the fact that black, white, and red has kind of supplanted the Hunter Rose storyline as being his milieu. That kind of came about after the Black, White, and Red, White, and Black series. We then went back and recolored the original Grendel Devil by the Deed in
That's
Black,
right.
White, and Red, and the Masters edition was in Black, White, and Red. So that is just, it has a certain not only Art Deco but a film noir sort of flavor that really is well applied to Hunter's story arc.
Yeah. Um, Now, talk about the ending of the Kimiko relationship there, because you said they didn't own it, but there was still some struggles or something. I don't know the full story. That
Sure. Well, they in a nutshell, they declared bankruptcy, and for a while, it was considered an asset of the company. So even though I had bankruptcy clauses in my contract is civil law, bankruptcy law is federal law. But eventually, the situation worked out where I was able to reclaim it,
Yeah,
and
that's good.
I took it to Dark Horse, and have had a very happy publishing relationship with Dark Horse ever since.
That's awesome. And then you started off that with War Child, that 10-issue series, War
Yes.
Child,
Yep.
and that was
And
just
there again, we just wanted to, we wanted to like just change everything and come out of the gate with this big, giant, over the top action adventure. Just a roller coaster that
futuristic.
lasted and tried to fit in like every kind of genre thing I could. There were pirates, there were zombies,
Vampires.
there was apocalyptic shit, there was vampires, there
Yeah.
was,
To
just
what degree do you recommend people that want to get into Grendel to read, start at Hunter Rose and kind of progress in the same order that they were written versus just jump in anywhere?
I of course I would like people to start and read it linearly, but I absolutely realize that that's not necessary. I have tons of people that come and say to me, "Hey, I started with War Child," or "Hey, I
Right.
started with God and the Devil," or "Hey, I started with the Christine Spar story arc." Um,
That's awesome.
Luckily, I think each of them you get a feeling for Grendel just based on the story, and then when you realize, oh wow, there's all these other versions, and that's if you liked it enough, you'll go start digging those up. I mean, that's a nice thing about comics is I always talk about, if you're trying to turn on a friend to comics, if you can find that right one, they'll
Yeah.
be hooked, and they'll go search out other comics because they love the experience so much. There's an intimacy there that we used to say, what's special about comics as opposed to film? And it used to be, well, anything can happen in a comic. You can draw Superman pushing a planet. You can draw, giant explosions and anything, magic. Well, now of course with CGI that's possible in film as well. But again, I think there's an intimacy in comics, a visual intimacy that it's just you alone with that thing, as opposed to there's a certain distance viewing things on screen, I think, and in film, of course, the screen's across the room, whereas
Yeah.
with a comic, it's in your hands.
Yeah.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
You're preaching to the choir about trying to find that one comic to recommend. That's literally what our company's all about. Is that we're trying
Yeah.
to introduce people to just these amazing comics. Some more questions from the audience here. We have HP Fabe is asking, and Perlman, I did see your question. We're just going to get into a bit later. HP Fabe saying, what were your thoughts on initially introducing Stacy Palumbo? So showing a softer side to Hunter and the Wolf, or giving them a connection? Any reason she wasn't more prominent later on? Is the question.
I don't know what he means by was more prominent
Yeah.
later on. Later on, how? She's absolutely instrumental in the end of the story. She's his downfall. And she's present in a lot of those short stories we mentioned, the Black, White, and Red, White, and Black. So don't quite know.
But I guess what were your thoughts on introducing Stacy Palumbo? Did you want to show?
Well, the reason was to throw in this foil to this Uberman. I mean, Hunter's nothing can defeat him. He's continually daring the world to take him down. One of the things he loves about Argent is that Argent gives him a fight that the rest of the world can't do. And to have him lose to a little girl that he has all this affection for, and lose in a way that he didn't even realize he was losing, is just an absolute ironic twist to his downfall.
Yeah.
He dominated by being heartless. As soon as he let his heart open a little bit, down he went.
That's a lesson for all. Wait, no, it's not a lesson.
Like I said, it's more an irony than a lesson.
Yes. Another question from Tade, sorry. While I do love your art, you've also worked with many others. Tim Sale would be my favorite. Who were the artists that you loved to work with or matched your writing style?
Oh man, there's so many in that. Okay, talking about Stacy there. I did a one of those black, white, and red stories for Jill Thompson, who, of course, and I've known Jill since she was 15 or 16 years old, seen her around conventions all the time, and of course, she developed into such a terrific artist, and her watercolor style is just phenomenally beautiful. And so I wrote a story that was basically a Grendel children's book. So it was about Lil Grendel. And
so cute.
and then at the end, you get to the end and you realize it's Stacy in her later years in the insane asylum drawing this for herself. Another one. So with each of these, I would approach the person and say, A, what do you like about Grendel? Or B, what do you feel like drawing? I can basically make anything you want in this story. And Chris Sprouse said to me, I want to draw architecture. So I wrote him 8 full-page illustrations that were basically panoramas of the city at various, like the spires of a church or the side of a skyscraper or etc., with little figures of Grendel and Argent kind of tumbling and fighting their way through each scene. And then I wrote a little kind of poetic caption under each one that kind of tried to sum up that moment.
I love that so much.
He mentioned Tim Sale. This is an interesting tale about that. So Tim loves noir narratives, and so I wrote him a really dark one, and it was a takeoff on the famous horse's head scene in The Godfather, where of course the guy wakes up and his prize racehorse head is decapitated and in bed with him. And I did the same thing, only it was with a gangster's girlfriend, his Moll. He wakes up and her body's there and her head's gone. And Tim very embarrassedly called me, and we were very tight friends, so this wasn't really a big deal. But he said, dude, I can't draw this. I can't draw a naked, headless woman. I just can't do it. And I was like, all right, man. So I'll just rewrite you something else. So I wrote him a different story, and that story ended up winning the Eisner for Best Short Story that year. So it just goes to show how the creative process is unpredictable, right?
I love that so much about the creative.
The other story, then, the one that Tim found he couldn't draw,
was
drawn by. It was also that came later. It was drawn by John Paul Leon, and he just did a magnificent job. It was basically 3 panels a page as we go through this guy who's refusing to pay Grendel and is trying to lead a little bit of a rebellion, and then Grendel kills the girl. And John did such a beautiful job with the storytelling, just the visual storytelling of how this moved from panel to panel, moment to moment. And my original thought was to do it silent, to have no words at all, just and see if we could get it across what happened. And he did such a beautiful job, but I thought to myself, all right, but this needs some kind of verbiage. So basically, I put one word in each panel. So like betrayal, appeasement, denial, as we step our way through the story panel by panel. So here again, just trying to show the many different ways I try and mix things up storytelling wise. Awesome. Again, there were so many people I worked with. I don't want to shortchange any of them. They were all just fabulous. So there's a handful.
That's great. I love how collaborative that is. It's that's just a great. Just like on one hand, art can be created because you have something you want to say, and here's the thing, I'm going to make this. But the collaborative aspect of like saying, I have, what do you want to do, and let's make something together, and together it's going to be better than one person could have done individually.
Yep. The whole's greater than the sum of the parts. Yep.
It's great. Tate actually asks again, for the first Grendel series, why did you choose to explore Christine Spar instead of the quote-unquote obvious choice of Stacy Palumbo? And why give Stacy such an awful life?
Well, because that's what happened. Again, as I said, when you not only enact violence, but when you're close to violence, I just saw no way Stacy was going to come out of that unscathed. She was going to be, she basically commits murder murders these two like uber creatures, these two invincible characters when she's 8 or 9. That's not going to end well for her. That's you're going to carry that for the rest of your life. So it just seemed obvious that there would be some legacy to it, that she would ultimately have a child and probably not have much to do with the raising of that child, and the child, again, the whole Shakespearean thing about, the sins of the father come down on the blah, 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 blah. Another thing I always try and do with Grendel, in addition to not moralizing, is not fully define the concept. So if you look at it in one level, you could say, oh, it's a demonic entity. It is choosing its incarnations, it's choosing its hosts, it's moving down the line. But I never fully describe it that way. At one point, Hunter Rose in Behold the Devil, Hunter Rose thinks he encounters a demon that tells him there's going to be this legacy after you. Hunter rips that part out of his journals and burns it. And let's face it, Hunter's an unreliable narrator, so
Yes.
maybe he was hallucinating, and maybe it's just a popular zeitgeist. Maybe it's societal and psychological movements. Again, I don't try and give a firm answer because that would limit me creatively, with it not defined, I can kind of do whatever I want,
Before we move on to some other creations you've worked on, Grendel reached a peak in its popularity when it started collaborating with and showing up with Batman and the Shadow. How did those even come to be?
Well, the Batman one, the first Batman one, I didn't have much of anything to do with so far as lining it up. It was in those days, publishers got together at cons and some drinking started going on, and these ideas started cropping up, and they came to me and said, we've got DC interested in doing a crossover with Batman, and so great, and in fact, that was the first crossover where DC teamed up with an independently owned character,
Oh, cool.
Yep.
How did you marriage the whole Gotham versus New York thing? You don't even talk about it, or like how do you?
I just had Grendel was bored and he went to Gotham City.
Okay.
And in fact, the first scene is Hunter Rose just happens to be sitting next to Bruce Wayne at the Gotham's Men's Club.
Of course.
And they're both, they share a little tete-a-tete back and forth, and you get to see their similarities and their differences. So that was a big success, and then I approached DC. At this point, Grendel had migrated to Dark Horse, and I approached DC and said, "Hey, let's do it again, and let me do it with Grendel Prime. And instead of this dense psychological mystery, which is what the first one was, we'll do it as this big action-packed superhero romp, And so that's how the second one came about. And then with the Shadow, so I had. Over the years, I had gotten a chance to work with a variety of other mainstream characters. I always viewed that as a band doing. I make a lot of musical references, don't I? I always view that as a band doing cover songs. Songs that inspired them. And I got to play with some of the big guys, and kind of one of the last ones on my bucket list was the Shadow. And at that point, Dynamite Entertainment had the Shadow, so I wrote the Shadow year one for them. I didn't have time to draw it at the time. And then they came to me and said, well, what do you think about a Shadow Grendel crossover? Yeah. And so following Batman Grendel, I had been approached by a ton of people to do crossovers with Grendel.
Oh.
Every indie character you can almost imagine came up to me at one point. But after Batman, where do you go? And but the Shadow meant a lot to me when I was a teen. And of course, the Shadow was a huge inspiration for Batman, and so I thought, yeah, that one I'll do. So we
how do you deal with the time periods on that one?
Oh, through a thing.
Sure.
One of the Shadow's main villains is a Fu Manchu-esque character called Shiwan Khan.
Yeah.
And I had Hunter Rose. We find out Hunter Rose has a private collection of artifacts from both famous criminals and famous writers. So, like, he has a quill and pen that belonged to Charles Dickens.
Right.
He has a Tommy gun that belonged to Clyde Barrow. He had et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so these fortune hunters dig up this Chinese vase that there's some sort of scroll in it, and it's a mystic scroll. And of course, Hunter can read ancient Mandarin, and he reads it aloud, and it takes him back in time to the 30s.
Perfect.
And he gets to the 30s, and he's like, "Well, this is a whole new underworld to take over. So let's get started."
Let's get started. That's awesome. Now, obviously, we've been talking a lot about Grendel, but you've written for a lot of other. You talked about Shadow, and there was Sandman Mystery Theater and Green Hornet and whatnot. And we have a question from Improv GM saying, "Are there other works of yours that you'd suggest that subvert the style or genre the way the first several Grendel arcs do?"
Subvert. No, I don't think subvert as much. As time went on, I tried to dig deep into what makes a character a character. Like, for instance, I wrote for Dynamite Entertainment, I wrote the Zorro comic for about 4 years, and of course Zorro has been portrayed many different ways, and it can go as far as the comedic satire of Zorro the Gay Blade, or the kind of lighthearted stuff that was the Disney show. And I was trying to give it a slightly more, I don't want to call it dark, but just a slightly more crucial and imperiled sense to his crusade, and that too led to a crazy crossover event. The guys that owned Dynamite approached me and said, and we're talking about doing a Django Zorro crossover. Would you be interested in co-writing that with Tarantino? And I was like, well, that's never going to happen, but okay, sure. So I kind of totally forgot all about it. And a couple months later, they called me back and they said, "Hey, we sent Tarantino all your Zorro stuff. He loves it. He wants you to come down to his house next week." And I kept saying to my wife, "This is going to fall apart at any second. It's going to be like, when I pulled up to the gate at his house, I was just like, all right, am I going to get rung in here? Or is this going to be like, oh, sorry, man, I forgot, But no, rang me in. We spent like 2 days at his house writing this
Wow.
writing this miniseries. And
I did not know this.
Yep. And watching movies in his private screening room. He loves, when he first starts working with somebody, he wants to watch movies together that he has handpicked to get you both in the mindset of what you're doing. And,
what was it? What did you watch?
So we watched one. It was one of Sam Fuller's earliest films, starring Vincent Price, and it's actually what we kind of based the story arc on, because it's based on a real occurrence. It was called The Baron of Arizona. And this is based on a historical dude and historical events. When the Western expansion happened and the United States finally pushed all the way to the West Coast, they had a deal that they would offer any land grants made by the Spanish crown to Spanish citizens. So this one dude spent 10 years setting up this scam, forging documents. He joined a monastery in Spain so he could get into the archives, and using period appropriate ink alter these ledgers. And he came back to the United States and declared himself to be the Baron of Arizona. And eventually it all came crumbling down, but this really audacious scam this guy tried to pull. And so we based it on that, but in ours we called him the Archduke of Arizona because that just sounds more cool and comic booky,
Great.
Yep.
I got to see
that. We watched a couple of chapters of various Zorro serials, movie serials, and then we watched a swashbuckler I had never seen called the Son of Monte Cristo, which is supposed to be ostensibly the son of the Count of Monte Cristo. But he looks like Zorro. He wears a mask and a cape, and he has a sword, and it's very daring do sort of thing. That's a fun flick if you've never seen it.
Wow. And
the other cool part was everything was on film. Nothing was digital or on DVD.
Wow.
This is all from his private collection. He had a screening room, and he had a projectionist. There was a dude back there threading these all up for us, who I never saw. he was like the dwarf in the cave. You know what I mean? Like,
That's so cool.
yep.
Oh, that's living the dream there, Matt. I love that.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun.
Okay, so we
Oh,
only
here
got
I
about.
got one more little tidbit about that. So
Yes, please.
we were as we're going through it, we decided we wanted to have a flashback for Django, and there was a scene that he had in the original script of him and King Schultz going to a steakhouse in, I want to say, Tennessee, so a deep South slave state, and King has a bounty on somebody there, the owner, and so Quentin very famously writes all of his scripts out longhand and then has them transcribed by somebody else, right? So he told me he still had this, the hand scripted version, but he got up and acted out the whole scene. So he fell into this character and then into that character. He walked around the room and did the whole scene, and he kept telling me he was going to send me the script, and he never did. But luckily, he had acted the whole thing out, and I was able to remember almost all of it. So I just did it from his performance.
Oh wow! I just love hearing about the creative process of how different creative people do, come up with their things and how
and in different instances, every situation is a little bit different. So
that's great. Well, we got 15 minutes left in this Q&A, and obviously this whole thing is instigated because
let's talk about the game. Yeah,
we're making a game. We're making a game. So how did the whole how did Grendel the game even come to be? And this is actually more of your story than my story. So how did this happen?
Well, I was talking to Matt Kent, and you had just done mind management with him, and he said, yeah, you should give Jay a call or an email and see about doing a Grendel game. I think that would work out great. And
Wow.
So I dropped you an email, and it just all kind of fell into place from there, step by step. I mean, it took a while, but this game's pretty sophisticated. I'm not surprised it took a while. There's a lot of thought that went into it, a lot of thought and a lot of design.
Your story about the Tarantino is my story about you, which is like, and then I got an email from Matt Wagner. This is amazing. So that's very exciting. So we did have a question from Kevin, and this is not on the here. He asked us on the our Kickstarter. He just wants to know: are you a board gamer, and what kind of games do you like to play?
I am not that much. My children are. My daughter is a giant Catan fan. And my son gets together with his bros, and they smoke a little and drink a little, and they play games. And I think Scythe is one of their current faves. But he's really anxious to get his hands on this.
What are we seeing? What are we seeing here up on the screen?
Oh, so we're going to show some of the art from the.
This is original
all new art by me in the game itself.
Yeah.
So these images you're seeing there are on, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Jay, but these are on the sides of the inner box, right?
That's right.
Yep. So here's, if we can close up on that.
Yeah.
So there's the finish.
Two
sides with, so you can play 4 factions in the game. So there's Grendel, and that's the mob.
Wow. And then
there's the cops and Argent.
Oh, so good. And I'll show you the finished version. And we have this now with all color. We got the Grendel. The police looks great.
Yeah.
Argent, amazing. Look at that. Looks so good.
I particularly like the guy in the butcher's apron with the axe over on the side.
Oh. So, what were your thoughts or
that was an initial rough for an idea to maybe have those illustrations on the back, and we decided not to do that. We wanted to give them a little more space to breathe, and it was Jay's idea to do them on the sides of the inside box, because I just think worked out great.
It did, yeah. It really highlights the 4 different factions nicely, I think.
Yeah.
I guess what we're have you seen Mind Mansion, or you just talked to Matt and he told you about the game?
I think I was just talking to Matt or emailing probably, and he told me about the game, and then I went and looked it up.
Yeah.
And then I realized you had done. I think you were right in the middle of Harrow County at that point.
That's right. Yeah.
But And then I think you sent me a copy of Mind Management, and
I
I
think
opened it up and I was like, holy cow, this is amazing. It was just so beautifully produced, and so, as I said, so sophisticated in every aspect. I mean, uh,
what were your expectations for us with regards to delivering a game? Like, were you expecting?
I wasn't expecting this, because I got to say, when we were coming up with this and you were telling me that, I was like, well, everybody's going to want to be Grendel.
Right?
Right? But you have this completely clever aspect of the fact that every different faction has a different method of gameplay that has both its strengths and its limitations. And that makes it, from a game standpoint, absolutely intriguing. I don't have that piece of art hanging around here.
Yeah. And so take us through when, like, were you expecting also to just? I can't remember if you told me or not to focus just on a rose, or if you were expecting something that spanned more of the centuries.
Yeah, I just thought, I mean, I guess we could have figured out a way to have a million different versions of Grendel, but I don't know. That just seemed like a bucket of worms that might have been too deep.
Sure. Yeah.
And as it is, you've come up with a real intricate set of factions and players and styles of play. And oh my god, I just think if we would have had a bunch of Grendels, it would have been maybe a morass.
It's funny, and we'll get into this. We have a Q&A coming up this coming week with Sen and Alara, the co-designers of the game Grendel, and we'll get into this. But we every faction. Oh, there it is. There's the.
This is the art for the captains of the
Yes.
of each faction. This is for the expansion pack. This is the press
Yes. Oh,
editor of some newspaper.
yeah, I love it. We have more. Yes, but we were when they were designing the game, Grendel. Every faction had grunts, but as we were playing it, we couldn't make sense of why Grendel had grunts because
No, Grendel flies alone. Yeah.
So
yeah.
we really we kind of said that they're. I think we called them shades. Like Grendel fast. It's not a grunt. It's just he's here. He's everywhere, and that worked for quite a while until eventually it just felt like we got to get him down to one piece. But that was really hard to figure out how to balance one piece versus the mob, and the police have tons of pieces. So we'll get into that in our Q&A with the designers.
And then just the cool aspect of the towers and all that, it adds a physicality to the game that I think is a real unique strength.
Yeah, that's good. I'm excited. And so when you first saw it, being not a uber gamer, were you? I don't know. Were you confused? Were you excited? Were you?
I was blown away. I was just like, "Holy cow! They've put so much effort into this. they really know what they're doing." Sure, I was a little confused because again, I'm not an avid gamer, but I mean, it all made sense to me. It wasn't. Again, anybody that has any interest in playing games will be able to figure it out. No problem.
That's good.
My son said the same thing. He's like, "This is going to be like when me and my buddies play this. The first time will be a little working our way through it, and then boom, it'll be off to the races."
That's right. Oh, so cool. We did have a question from our Kickstarter page. Somebody wanted to know about any kind of. Is there a new collection of all the Grendel storylines in any way coming out?
Well, there are currently omnibuses available.
So that's available. Even all the hard
there are currently 6 volumes of that, and each one of them is 500 or 600 pages thick. So you're literally talking thousands and thousands of pages of material and centuries of story time. I'm currently working on a series that is broken up into 4 parts. So four parts of 4 issues each. The collective title is Devil's Crucible. And that's coming out like 1 set per year. But ultimately we'll have more material, and there will be another omnibus added to the giant tome of shelf of tomes. And
it's amazing. And in our last few minutes here, and again, if there's any other questions, please feel free to ask them out there in the audience. But you've also been recently working with Kelly Jones on a retelling of not a retelling, a in between the lines or a before the book of Dracula of the Count's adventures.
Before, during, and after. Kelly and I have been doing this series of graphic novels about Dracula, and we do it through Kickstarter. And then you can that's where you get the hardcover editions. But then Dark Horse Comics is releasing it in softcover trades. We are sticking religiously close to the book, but we are not doing an adaptation of the book.
I see.
Castle, none of that stuff that is part of the traditional things. But the book is full of these tantalizing details about Dracula that we felt were ripe material for further storytelling. Like, for instance, book 1 is called The Impaler, and it's based upon 2 references Van Helsing makes in the book. The fact that when he was alive, Dracula attended something called the Scholomance, which is this school for the dark arts that Satan himself hosts way up in the mountains. It's a tenure of 7 years, and he takes 10 scholars at a time, and at the end of the 7 years, he keeps one of them.
Wow.
And I thought, how has nobody done anything with that? Yeah. That's amazing. That's a whole story in and of itself, you know.
Great.
So the first volume is how he becomes a vampire. And, you know, again, in the book too, we see him exhibiting powers that the other vampires we see don't have: controlling the weather, controlling animals, turning into animals. You know, granted, we don't see that many other vampires, but none of them do that. So these are all necromancy skills that he learned at the Scholomance. You know,
that's awesome.
So the second one's called The Brides because, you know, he has the 3 brides that show up in the book and in so many of the movie versions. Well, what are their story? We tell their stories. You know, each of them has to be a completely different woman.
What a
He has
cool
to have
idea.
a completely different motivation for why he wanted each one of them. You know,
oh, that's great. That's fantastic. So, and when is the third one hitting Kickstarter?
Every Kickstarter for this is October, so that we cross over Halloween because it's Dracula, baby.
That's awesome.
Yep.
Now, there's a watcher named Prillman who's going to kill me if I don't ask you about the Grendel Netflix series.
Oh, sad but true.
Yeah.
You know, just Hollywood bullshit is all I can say. They filmed the whole thing. It was in post-production. And does everybody remember about 4 years ago now when Netflix just did a nosedive? Like their stock just crashed.
And they dumped
they went crazy and had this giant managerial purge. And we lost the executive that was in charge of our show. And as is so common in Hollywood, the guy that inherited it was just like, not my thing. And so he just elected not to finish the show. He said, "We'll just take the $50 million write-off instead."
Wow.
Yep. So it's very sad. I have the whole thing on a DVD.
Can we all come over to your house and watch it?
It still needs about 10 million in post-production, but it's very watchable. Like, you can tell what the story is very clear, you know. But like occasionally a green screen shows up behind somebody, you know. It's full of production notes in the upper left-hand corner, you know.
Wow. That's
now, all that said, there is something in the works, and I can't talk about it yet.
Don't talk about it then.
Yep.
We didn't hear. We don't know what you're talking about.
But there's a potential thumbs up, so we'll see.
That's amazing. This has been so amazing to get to know you and understand a bit more about the history of how Grendel came to be through your mind and how he's progressed and jumped ship to other comics and how you've taken your skills and done other comics with that and your now blossoming friendship with Quentin Tarantino. I'm sure you guys hang out.
I haven't talked to him since. You know what I mean? That's Hollywood too. You know, it's like 2 ships have passed in the night sort of deal. You know.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Matt, for your time today. And we'll hopefully see great success with our Grendel game, and maybe we can explore future Grendel incarnations in the gaming somehow with expansions or something. Who knows?
Because let me just reiterate, I could not be happier with how the game turned out. Everybody, these guys did a fabulous job of both creating this unique game, but also managing to incorporate so much of the narrative into the game. I mean, it's really terrific.
Yeah, we just unlocked early on Stacy, which was mandatory. She had to be in the game somehow, so we unlocked her, and then the informants, which we unlocked, and we have a stretch goal coming up that people don't know about, where we're going to unlock new art from you if we achieve it for the informants, and so I'm excited to showcase that off when we get there. So
somebody asked me. if we had the moment where Stacy drowns her nanny, and I said, "Yeah, it's in there. Stacy's in it," and her hand sticking up out of the water is in the game.
One of the cards. That's right. It's all in there. Yeah. Matt, thank you so much for your time today, and thanks everybody.
Thanks, Jay. And thanks everybody for showing up.